the doctrine of two natures, superior metaphysical being and inferior physical becoming, mortal, chaotic. Civilization must order itself to the superior principle of being for active liberation. Superior metaphysical being and inferior physical becoming describes the fundamental doctrine of the two natures that underpins all traditional civilizations, providing an absolute point of reference for understanding modern deviations. The superior metaphysical being, essere, constitutes the highest ontological plane in the doctrine of the two natures, which serves as the fundamental premise for understanding the traditional world. It is the realm of the invisible and non-tangible. It is referred to as the superworld, which acts as the true principle and true life. It is the nature of the immortals. The order of that which is cannot concern itself with human or temporal states and conditions. This principle is anterior and superior to time and history. Traditional civilizations were characterized by sensing what lies beyond time. The first age of the traditional cycle, the Age of Gold, is essentially the age of being and truth in a transcendent sense. The inferior physical becoming refers to the physical order and the mortal nature. This is the lower realm of becoming, comprising the visible and tangible. It is characterized by flux, impermanence, dependence, and instability. The inferior realm is inherently chaotic. It includes the demonic soul of nature. It also encompasses everything that is merely human, which is subject to birth, death, impermanence, dependence, and alteration. The ceaseless becoming is closely associated with a state of life marked by blind craving and irrational identification. It represents a radical and original abandonment or failure to achieve a perfect form. In social terms, the substance of the common people, demos, is considered demonic and requires catharsis or liberation before it can form a traditional system. Active liberation is the highest aim of every truly traditional civilization. It represents the triumphant movement from the mortal and contingent nature of becoming to the superior, incorruptible nature of being. Active liberation is the participation in the superworld and a transcendent spiritual victory. It is conceived as a passage from one birth to another, enabling a mortal man to become an immortal god. This liberation is achieved through intentional, demanding practices rather than passive devotion or faith. The two primary paths for approximation to the superior realm are the heroic action and contemplation. The path of action involves the concept of the Great Holy War. This is the internal struggle of the highest principle in man against his inferior nature, desire, passion, fear, irrational impulse, weakness. The external war, the small holy war, is prescribed as a means to realize this internal struggle, acting as a sacrificial and purifying rite. The realization results in a triumphal death, where the warrior breaks the human bond and is transmuted and liberated, achieving the luminous realm of the immortals. The contemplative path, ascesis in the strict sense, involves internal integration by detaching from sensible reality, neutralizing individual reasoning faculties, and progressively stripping the consciousness to achieve super-rational illumination. Active liberation contrasts sharply with passive forms of salvation or liberation based merely on belief, sentiment, or external ritual. In traditional civilization, the function of the king, rex, was historically inseparable from that of the high priest or bridge builder, pontifex. Rex represents the temporal authority ruling the world of men. Pontifex, meaning the maker of bridges or ways, as pons archaically meant way, refers to the individual who facilitates the passage or connection between the natural, temporal, and the supernatural realms. This identification, Rex Pontifex, signifies that true sovereigns embody a stable life that is beyond life. Their authority is rooted not merely in political power, wisdom, or physical courage, but in this essential transcendent quality. The traditional king is understood as an individual who, by innate or acquired superiority over the mere human condition, incarnates the effective and living presence of a force from above within the temporal order. This force is viewed as a formidable reality, granting the ruler a natural and absolute sovereign right. It has been referred to by various names, such as Varano, Mazdean, meaning glory or supernatural fire, which imparts immortality and victory. In ancient Egypt, royal force, UAS, was manifested as a celestial thunderbolt-like fluid that consecrated the king's solar triumphal nature. This power is intrinsically linked to stability. In Vedic formulas for consecration, the sovereign is implored to stand firm and unwavering, be as unwavering as a mountain, stand firm as heaven itself. This stability, dead in Egyptian tradition, reflects the enduring nature of the superior realm of being. The concept of the Chakravarti, or universal lord, literally turner of the wheel, represents the archetype of the royal function. The Chakravarti is the immobile center. The wheel symbolizes the flux of samsara, the chaotic current of becoming. As the center, the Chakravarti represents the spiritual stability inherent in someone who does not belong to this chaotic current. This polar function of kingship is critical. Just as the North Star remains fixed while all other stars revolve around it, the sovereign embodies immutability in the middle, which maintains the ordered course of human affairs and the state. The primary function of the king, possessing this superior force, is to order the temporal realm. The visible world of becoming is naturally chaotic, demonic, and requires formation and purification. By their presence and pontifical mediation, spiritual influences radiate from the sovereign into the world of men. This radiating spiritual force acts as a dam against the dark forces of the inferior nature, organizing life to serve as a base for superior realization and propitiating prosperity and fortune. The ordering principle applied by the sovereign is the transcendent law or justice, making the Chakravarti also the Dharmaraja, or Lord of the Law. In Sanskrit, Dharma means proper nature or law of a being. Therefore, the Dharmaraja enforces a primordial legislation that hierarchically orders every function and form of life according to the inherent nature of each individual, Svadharma. This law, related to RTA in Vedic tradition, is fundamentally connected to truth, reality, and the stability of that which is. The law is not of purely human origin, which would be unknown or absurd to the traditional man, but is divine and absolute, providing an infallible and inflexible framework for the state. To exercise this function as a king of justice, the sovereign must possess superior knowledge. This wisdom is the science of that which is, enabling the formulation of laws conforming to transcendent and objective truth. The right is foundational to traditional organization and is the means by which the individual and the collective connect to the transcendent. The mysterious nature of the right lies in its capacity to function as an effective link to the superior, invisible realm. The right, alongside fidelity, was the element that connected individual parts and activities to the ruling center, the divinely sanctioned sovereign, and facilitated the participation of individuals in the transcendent influence emanating from the head of the society. The right's effectiveness stems from it being a precise, intentional action, often framed as a sacrificial or purifying action. For the modern secular mind, a rite is often reduced to a mere ceremony, appreciated only for its symbolic or emotional value. However, the original Latin term, ceremonia, comes from the root creo, related to Sanskrit kar, to do, to act in the sense of creating, meaning it was not a conventional celebration, but a truly creative action. The most complete form of the rite is the sacrifice, which corresponds to an action that is generative of a god or hero. Sacrifice symbolizes the primordial force reacting against itself, freeing itself, and ascending to a superior way of being. It is an intentional action that determines a crisis and activates the divine from the substance of the gathered influences, acting as a renewal of the violence that tore inferior forces away from themselves and liberated them into a superior form. The ultimate goal of rites, like the initiation of the Egyptian king, which repeated the sacrifice of Osiris, was to achieve a new birth, which was immortalizing, and to establish an identity of nature with the divine. The rite involved purification, often through a symbolic death and resurrection, and the activation of a force from above. The correct execution of the rite directly ensured the operational presence of superior realities in the temporal realm. The rite served as a means to propitiate the possibility of an active relationship with invisible forces. It was the means by which spiritual influences were radiated into the world of men from the sovereign or other qualified practitioners, providing a supernatural support to the overall life of the tradition. The rite prepared causes in the invisible, which would result in effects in the tangible world, e.g., fortune, prosperity, and victory. The establishment of rites was considered of maximum importance for the governance of an empire because they were the channels through which the ways of heaven can be grasped. The Sanskrit term RTA refers to the original cosmic and divine order. The fact that the word ritus, rite, is connected to this root is significant. The rite, therefore, is an action that conforms human behavior to this objective, transcendent law order. The rite is instrumental both for the personal destiny of the individual and for the structure of civilization. For the individual, the participation in the superior realm is achieved through the initiation, which is itself a form of ritually mediated transit. The rite provides the means for active liberation from the human bond, leading to participation in the superworld and spiritual triumph over the merely physical order. The ritual death of the hero or god, like Osiris, provides the template for the spiritual transformation of the mortal man into an immortal god. Rites were the original cement of both small and large traditional organizations. A state, traditionally, was understood as an appearance of the superworld and a way toward it. Only by performing the rites could the king or the patres, magistrates, maintain the overall stability and order of the community, serving as a dam against the dark forces of the inferior nature. A rite omitted or incorrectly performed was a source of misfortune and meant releasing fearsome forces back into the moral and material order, allowing chaos to enter the world. Evola then moves on to talk about patrician primacy, distinguishing the aristocratic ruling class from the common populace, plebeians. The primacy, superior authority, and status of the patriciate is not based on material factors like wealth or political power, but on a sacred tradition. This tradition constitutes a non-material inheritance, which includes a supernatural quality that is passed down through the blood. This heritage is based on an action analogous to sacrifice performed by the ancestors, which generated this supernatural quality. These ancestors were not simple mortals, but beings who, upon death, achieved a transcendent and incorruptible life of a god. They were heroes or demigods who had triumphed over the second death and achieved participation in the superworld. Their victory over the mortal nature established a supernatural quality or spiritual heritage that remained as a potential force in the lineage. The crucial difference between the patrician and the plebeian is the ability of the former to maintain and activate this transcendent heritage. The patrician quality is maintained and developed via the uninterrupted execution of rites. These rites and ceremonies serve to actualize and nourish the original supernatural influence, making the inherent quality active and effective in the individual. The rites that governed the life of patrician lineages were rigorous and secret. They contained the secret of a transformation and domination realized within the vital substrate of the lineage. This entire structure of inherited divine quality and necessary ritual access was explicitly denied to the plebeians. The plebeians were characterized by the expression, "are without rights, do not have ancestors." Their ancestors were not divine ancestors. Plebeians and servants correspond to the demos, whose underlying substance is generally considered demonic in the ancient, non-moralistic sense, belonging merely to nature and requiring catharsis or liberation. While patricians practiced rites to maintain a superior quality of form in dominion over chaos, the plebeians possessed only customs. Their religious practices were typically of a collective and chthonic, earthbound nature. The patrician class, possessing these sacred rites and this divine lineage, held the exclusive capacity for mediating the supernatural. The aristocracy's capacity to perform their own particular cult, being simultaneously the sacerdotal class, ensured that only they could serve as the bridge between the human and supernatural realms. This spiritual authority derived from the same source as legitimate kingship, Rex Pontifex, where the Pontifex is the one who mediates between the natural and the supernatural. By extension, the head of the patrician family was the priest of the sacred fire and the natural mediator of every effective relationship with the suprasensible for his relatives and servants. Spiritual virility is the highest form of spiritual attainment in traditional, particularly Aryan civilizations. This state defines the essence of the original ruling elite, the patriciate and the sovereign, and stands in stark opposition to later, passive forms of spirituality, especially devotional religion. In its pristine form, the spiritual path of the traditional elite was fundamentally non-religious and based on precise action and knowledge. The term religion, in its current conventional sense, defined by affective disposition, devotional sentiment, a personal God, and moral law, was largely absent from the origins of the traditional world. Spiritual virility emphasizes acting without being subject to sentiments, fears, or hopes. Instead, one must know the precise relationships that, when a cause is correctly set through the rite, produce a necessary and constant effect in the order of invisible powers. The culmination of spiritual virility is achieving an independent central position that grants authority over the divine realm itself. Unlike the later Deus, conceived as a separate being or person, the original Roman concept of the noumen referred to a naked force, defined by its capacity to act and manifest, embodying the mysterious and formidable substance of the sacred. The spiritual man, or vir, opposed to homo, possessing this virility, has a character of centrality and dominion over these powers, which are often symbolized as the noumena. They are not the conditioned party, but the conditioning one, maintaining a central and superior position akin to the Cakravarti, immobile center. His dominion is so profound that in the ancient Indo-Aryan view, the Brahmana, the ritual master, was lord over the Brahman, the primordial vital principle, through the force of the rite. In ancient Egypt, priests possessing sacred formulas could even threaten great gods with destruction, and the king held titles like Bull of his mother, indicating that he possessed the original generative substance and was the conditioning element concerning the divine. The duality of the attributes defining the Roman patriciate, the lance and the rite, symbolically represents the fusion of spiritual authority and temporal power necessary for spiritual virility. The rite represents the sacerdotal or pontifical function, serving as the objective technique for accessing and directing the supernatural influences and law. The right to conduct the sacrifice was part of the jus quiritium, the primordial law held by the paterfamilias. The lance represents the regal, heroic, or warrior function. It symbolizes the principle of virile force, which ensures that the spiritual attainment translates into effective dominion in the world. The right of the lance, jus quiritium, was closely tied to the ownership of land and the ability to act with untamed authority. The synthesis of these two attributes defines the transcendent virility that characterized the highest traditional figures, reges sacrorum. Spiritual virility is positioned in absolute opposition to the passive feminized forms of spirituality that characterize later stages of civilization. Traditional symbolism viewed the supernatural principle as masculine and the principle of nature, desire, and becoming as feminine. The devotional religion prevalent in the modern sense, characterized by piety, sentiment, subordination, and dependence on a personal god, is viewed as an essentially feminine orientation. This feminilization of spirituality marked a descent associated with the lunar sacerdotal cycles and the mother civilization, where the masculine principle was either reduced to materialistic strength or subjugated to feminine authority. The way of spiritual virility, conversely, is characterized by heroic action, detachment, and command, qualities that are antithetical to submission, sentiment, and moralizing fear. It seeks an objective, active identification with the transcendent being, rather than a passive, devotional relationship with a conditioning deus. The two ways of the afterlife are the way of the gods, solar or superior, and the way of the ancestors, lunar or inferior. The solar, God's way. This is the superior, privileged, aristocratic sacred path leading to definitive liberation and immortality. This path is associated analogically with fire, light, the day, and the 6 months of the sun's ascent. It leads to the luminous dwelling of the immortals, which has various figurations such as celestial heights, the Valhalla, Asgard, the house of the sun reserved for kings, heroes, and nobles, or the state of Brahman. This state is the unconditioned state, characterized by being, transcendence, and incorruptibility. The ability to take is achieved by individuals, often heroes or demigods, who, upon physical death, do not emit a mere shadow of the ego. They are those who had triumphed over the second death. The second death is the total and final dissolution of the common personality. Triumphing over it requires an ontological transformation, often achieved through heroic action, the Great Holy War, or triumphal death, or initiatory rites. These intentional actions create a new birth and a glorified form, resulting in a transcendent life force that is no longer subject to dissolution. The lunar ancestor's way. This is the destiny of the average individual, the common man, who belongs to the naturalistic order. This path is associated with smoke, the night, and the 6 months of the sun's descent. It leads to the realm of Hades or infernos. This symbolizes the return to the chaotic and cyclical nature of becoming. Those who follow this path only achieve simple survival as a transient shadow or larva of the ego, which is destined for the second death. After this final dissolution, the individual's essential vital principles return to the totem or manes. The totem is conceived as the subpersonal ancestral current. The life force is reabsorbed into this perennial prima materia, from which life will sprout again in new individual forms, subject once more to impermanence. The individual is condemned to the cycle of generation or samsara, symbolized by the moon. Traditional civilizations sustain themselves by being structured from above and toward the above. Their life force is derived from a spiritual, non-material source. A civilization lives by adherence to a law that is not merely a mutable creation of men, but is divine and absolute, providing an infallible framework. This law is fundamentally connected to order and stability. This transcendent orientation means the entire socio-political order, the state, the empire, is meant to be an appearance of the superworld and a way toward it. Adherence to these traditional norms, laws, and rites allows the overall life of the community to be ordered and serves as a virtual base for spiritual realizations. A civilization arises only when a superior, non-natural force acts upon the physical matter of race and blood. The race of the spirit is the subtle, essential element of a culture. It refers to the internal spiritual quality of the ruling elite, maintained through a sacred, non-material inheritance and rigorous rites. This spiritual race constitutes the most profound and solid core of a traditional society and ensures the continuous presence of the stabilizing influence of the superior realm. A civilization begins its decline when it loses contact with the unchanging superior realm. The fatal process begins when the ruling race of the spirit is prostrated or broken, meaning the race has lost contact with that which alone can provide stability, the world of being. The spiritual center dissolves when the spiritual and regal authority figures no longer genuinely embody the force from above, and their functions survive only as empty symbols. Once the dam against the dark forces of the inferior nature is broken, the collective organism descends fatally into the world of contingency. This is expressed by falling back into chaos from the cosmos. Breaking traditional laws, neglecting rights, or mixing castes signifies retroceding from the cosmos into the chaos, falling back under the power of the base elements and returning to the way of the infernos, where dissolution prevails. As the generating root from above is no longer vital, the spiritual basis of life is replaced by the solely temporal, human, and material. Institutions and activities, including the state and the law, lose their transcendent significance and function solely for temporal life. This leads to the triumph of rationalism and naturalism. Once the superior axis is lost, the societal organism disintegrates, leading to atomism of the individual. Individualism is characterized as the creation of an illusory center outside the true spiritual center, leading to the emancipation of the individual who claims absolute freedom and equality. This libertarian crumbling is itself a profound form of dissolution. The ultimate fatal reaction to rampant individualism is the rise of the collective. The emancipated free individual confronts the brute power of the collective. The final phase of this process is the inversion of the state into the modern Leviathan, a system that is mechanized and totalitarian. This collective tyranny strips the individual of personality and operates under the logic of the lowest elements, the servants or the fourth estate, leading to a materialist civilization defined by gold and labor. Chivalry, particularly the great medieval orders of knighthood, existed on a plane higher than mere politics, territory, or blood descent. Unlike the feudal aristocracy, which was tied to a specific land and personal loyalty to a local prince, chivalry presented itself as a super-territorial and supranational community. Members swore fidelity not to specific persons, but to a universal authority, which was essentially the empire. In the Christian ecumene, chivalry fit into the framework of the empire, mirroring the relationship between the clergy/monastic orders and the church. Chivalry was defined by a unique fusion of spiritual and martial roles, which was acquired rather than simply inherited by birth. Knights were consecrated to a military priesthood. This highlights the spiritual dimension of their action, which transcended the purely warrior function. Chivalry was not necessarily hereditary. Individuals could become knights. This set it apart from the old feudal aristocracy. The spiritual quality of a knight was conferred or realized through two distinct traditional means. Ordination. In the oldest forms, a knight could ordain another knight without the intervention of priests, suggesting a direct transmission of a fluid-like force. Later forms involved special religious rites. The ritual often occurred around Easter or Pentecost, symbolizing resurrection or the descent of the Spirit, and included purification, bath, and the vigil of arms. Heroic action. This is the alternative path, more direct and interior. It is linked to the doctrine of the holy war and triumphal death. Aspirants were required to perform deeds demonstrating heroic contempt for life. Heroic action, when ritually oriented, functions as a sacrifice to achieve immortality, and the victory attained becomes the visibility of a corresponding spiritual fact. The conduct of the knight was governed by a loyalty that targeted a transcendent ethical and political principle. The concept of fidelity/devotion was the cohesive element of the feudal and imperial world. For the knight, this fidelity was owed to an ethics whose fundamental values included honor, truth, courage, and loyalty. This ethics was non-Christian in its origin, representing an Aryan ethics. It prized honor over charity and humility, viewing cowardice and shame as worse than sin. This aligns with the concept of spiritual virility, which is antithetical to passive or devotional spirituality. The seemingly absurd devotion of knights to a specific lady often masked a profound esoteric meaning. The woman of chivalry, like the woman of the Ghibelline Fedeli d'Amore, was a symbolic representation of the holy wisdom. She was an incarnation of the transcendent or divine woman, symbolizing the power of transfiguring spirituality and a life not mixed with death. She guides the hero toward something more than human, granting illumination or transcendent wisdom. The pursuit of the divine woman symbolized the active and affirmative attitude of the man, hero, knight, relative to the feminine principle of the sacred, the spiritual force. The highest aspirations of chivalry were found in its connections to secret initiatory currents and the mythical quest for the Holy Grail. The heroic adventures of knights, particularly those associated with the Graal quest, were linked to an inner path. The Graal legend, which is pre-Christian in its essential elements, was profoundly felt by the chivalric world. The central motif of the Graal saga is a regal restoration. The knight is sought to revive a fallen kingdom, avenge or heal a wounded king, the Fisher King. This theme connects directly to the imperial myth and the idea of the supreme, invisible, and polar center of the world. This spiritual quest was the secret soul of the Ghibelline chivalry, supporting the ideal of restoring the traditional, sacred empire. The traditional caste system is a principal expression of an order based on the metaphysical idea of stability and justice. Society is divided into functional groups corresponding to the hierarchy of functions found in any superior organism governed by the spirit. In the most complete type, such as the ancient Indo-Aryan system, the hierarchy is generally quadripartite, corresponding to distinct functions. 1. Sacral heads, priests, pontifices, representing the spiritual authority and light center of the organism. 2. Warriors, nobility, rulers, representing the will, direction, and strength of the body. 3. Merchants, Bürgertum, economy, representing the metabolism and organic economy. 4. Servants, laborers, representing the undifferentiated and impersonal energies of matter and mere vitality. The divisions of the caste system reflect an ontological rather than merely social or economic hierarchy. The inequality of the castes is not arbitrary or unjust, but a reflection and formalization of a deeper, pre-existing and intimate inequality inherent in the nature of individuals. The belief is that physical birth in a specific caste is not chance, but corresponds to the nature of what the individual's I determined transcendentally before earthly birth, an aspect of the karma doctrine. The principle is that nature determines the birth, and in turn, birth helps the individual recall their true nature. The system operates as a superior application of the principle sum cuique, to each his own. Justice is achieved when every individual fulfills the function corresponding to their own nature. The hierarchy is a law of nature likened to lighter liquid resting above denser liquid. Heredity and the closure of the castes are crucial elements of the doctrine, ensuring the continuity of spiritualized quality. The law of caste demands conformity to one's own proper nature and inherent vocation. Dharma means proper nature or law of a being. Svadharma is the normal explanation of one's own nature and its realization within the overall traditional order. To exit one's caste, even for a supposedly higher activity, was considered equivalent to falling and becoming a pariah or patita. Hereditary transmission prepares a homogeneous group of conducive inclinations, organic, vital, and psychic. For the higher castes, this inheritance is fundamentally non-material and spiritualized. Rites and initiation were required to actualize and nourish this superior quality in the individual. The stability of the caste system allows for the spiritual purification of action, regardless of the action's material nature function. The traditional view draws a critical distinction between action and work. Action is the spiritual, pure, and free pole, while work is the material, impure, and heavy pole. The highest mode of living one's function is by acting detached from the fruits or results for the sake of the action itself, treating every act as a rite and an offering. This is the action of those who attain the supreme through active disinterestedness. This mode of action is achieved through bhakti, which, in its virile sense, is more akin to the fidelity of the Middle Ages than pietistic devotion. By performing one's svadharma with purity of heart and active devotion, an individual can attain the same dignity as anyone else, from servant to king, participating in the supernatural principle of the entire order. The adherence to svadharma through detached action maintains the entire cosmic and social structure. The term dharma comes from the root dr, meaning to sustain, carry, or hold high, expressing the element of order, form, or cosmos that tradition incarnates in opposition to chaos and becoming. Through the observance of dharma, the system is sustained, acting as a dam against the sea of contingency and temporality. Breaking the caste law was considered a sacrilege that harmed the efficacy of all rites and steered the culprit toward the infernos, the demonic influences of inferior nature. The caste system is thus a system of progressive degrees of conquest and victory of the cosmos over chaos. Slavery arises from the disdain for work when activity lacks spiritual meaning/right and is reduced to material labor. The arts retain magical symbolic content, and corporations, guilds for freemen, maintain sacral virile structure and impersonal honor in work. In complete traditional forms, the sacred radiated its influence downward, encompassing every aspect of social life, including those activities generally considered mundane in the modern world, such as professions, arts, crafts, and labor. The hierarchy of activities was understood as a relationship of potency to act. Lower order activities maintained their dignity by being viewed as symbols of superior activities. For example, the art of building was ritually performed by the king, who linked the physical construction to the divine invisible element, acting as an eternal work. Similarly, the cultivation of the land, while material labor, could be seen as a symbolic transposition of the cultivator of the field, the adept. This analogical correspondence allowed even mundane skills to act as a support for glimpsing transcendent meanings. The ancient world did not despise work because it knew slavery, but on the contrary, because it despised work, it despised the slave. Slavery was the condition assigned when activity, especially among the lowest strata, was not guided by any spiritual meaning or ritual. When activity was reduced to mere material labor tied to material needs, it appeared degrading and unworthy of any free man. For the slave, no dharma, proper function, could be conceived other than labor. Unlike the modern secular separation of art, the traditional arts retained an essential spiritual function. The world of tradition was marked by the inseparability of naturalistic elements in the arts from a magical symbolic intention. Ancient arts, figurative arts, theater, poetry, music, dance, were either related to mysteries and sacred dramas, or possessed content linked to vaticination, sacred inspiration, and incantation. For instance, certain ancient arts of construction displayed traces of a sacerdotal science. In the highest periods, traditional art was characterized by the emancipation from the purely aesthetic, subjectivistic, and human element. Productions attested to a single stylistic personality, often anonymous, which transcended the individual artist. Ancient arts were considered sacred to particular noumena or heroes, and involved the transmission of an internal tradition of the art, sometimes called arcanum magisterium, guarded as sacred and secret. For free men engaged in professional or artisanal activities, the need for order was met by corporations or guilds, which acted as miniature traditional societies. These associations, established by free men, reproduced the structure of the gens or patrician family. They were not devoid of a religious character and a structure of a virile and almost military type. Like a city or gens, guilds had their patron god or lar, daemon, common cults, and rites performed by the magister, master, who acted as priest. The Roman corporation was hierarchically structured ad exemplum rei publicae, after the example of the Republic, and animated by a military spirit. Within these bodies, the activity was bound by an ethic of impersonal honor, purity, and detachment. This ethos reflected the higher Aryan principles of action without attachment to results and active dedication, whereby the economic factor or mere profit was kept subordinate to the purity of the art. This ensured that the action was purified and free. The traditional spirit, particularly concerning paths to transcendence, is fundamentally divided into two major directions or approaches: the way of ascesis/contemplation and the active/heroic way. 1. The ascetic, contemplative way. This path focuses on interior transformation through detachment and purified knowledge. This is the method of progressive denudation of the consciousness by removing all external sensory reality and individual rationalizing faculties. The goal is achieved by the removal of every dross and every obstruction. Entwerdung. This term, used in German mysticism, like that of Toller, is the equivalent of the Plotinian simplification, referring to the necessary spiritual detachment and the gradual extinguishing of every image and every form. This path seeks liberation by neutralizing the conditioned world through detachment. It is often non-religious in the conventional sense, emphasizing knowledge over faith or sentiment. Original Buddhism. This is cited as a typical example, being a pure system of techniques that is free of religious elements and sentimentalism. Its method is fundamentally knowledge, aimed at dissolving irrational identification with conditioned existence. Neoplatonism, Plotinus. This philosophy embodies aristocratic asceticism, seeking similarity to the gods, not merely good men. Its method is interior simplification, as the center rejoins the center, leading to vision. Nirvana. This signifies the cessation of agitation and extinction of mania. It represents a superior life and is a dissolving of bonds, not dissolving but liberating. 2. Versus the active heroic way, e.g. holy war. This path emphasizes transcendent realization through supreme intensity of life and action, often martial in nature. This approach involves a process immanent to life, aimed at arousing the deepest forces of the human entity and pushing them to surpass themselves. Through a limit intensity, the apex of superlife is liberated from life itself. The goal is active liberation, ascesis, encompassing both the contemplative and active paths, defines the superkasta, a position above the four primary castes. The ascetic is he who frees himself from form because he renounces the illusory center of human individuality and turns directly towards the principle from which all form proceeds, rather than relying on participation in the social hierarchy. Ascesis holds an ideal place, intermediate between the plane of direct regal and initiatory Olympic superiority and that of the right and of Dharma. It is a path to direct realization of transcendence, necessary because the supreme reality is only achieved through profound ontological transformation that surpasses the conditioned existence guaranteed even by the highest caste. While the pariah is the subcaste, who escapes form due to incompetence and returns to the inferior world, the ascetic is the revered supercaste, who abandons form to pursue the source of all principles. This path allows for direct participation in the divine, a realization that is not always possible through the inherited social structure alone. Games are sacred expressions of action, not plebeian sport, where contests, races magically evoke, renew uranic forces, like Apollo's Hera's triumph over chthonic/titanic elements, and the victory ritually achieved confers divine character/immortality on the winner/the triumphator, serving as a sacrificial rite to break individual bonds and manifest mystic force in the community. Traditional civilization had a sense of time that was supratemporal, characterized not by linear progression, but by inherent quality and rhythm. Modern time is a simple, irreversible order of successive events, whose parts are homogeneous and measurable as quantity, indifferent to the events that occur within them. Conversely, traditional time is understood as a quality, defined by rhythm. It is fractured into cycles or periods, such as the Chaldean Great Year, the Etrusco-Latin Saeculum, the Hindu Kalpa. Each moment in traditional time has a meaning and a specific value relative to all others. These cycles form closed, perfect units that repeat as a series of eternities. Traditional systems often use fixed numbers, like 7, 9, or 12, not to express quantity, but to denote the typical structures of rhythm. Time was ritually measured by a transcendent time which contained meanings, not facts. The calendar, which served as the basis for time measurement, was sacred and entrusted to priestly castes. By ordering time from above and associating specific moments with celebrations, rites, or festivals, the traditional world sought to achieve liberation and transfiguration of time. This action stopped the confused flow of the waters, creating a transparency within the current of becoming that allows for the vision of the immobile depth. Furthermore, time had a magical aspect. Every point in a cycle presented influences and powers, making certain times propitious or unpropitious for specific actions. The traditional understanding of space was profoundly different from the abstract, homogeneous concept prevailing in modern thought. In the traditional experience, space is living and saturated with all kinds of qualities and intensities. The idea of space often merged with the concept of the vital ether, mana, a mysterious, omnipresent substance that is more psychic than physical. This subtle force is distributed throughout regions, imbuing each one with its own virtues and connecting it to the powers residing there. The space of the right was considered a more intensive stage of this general spatial perception, being living, fatalistic, and magnetic. Every place was a fatidical place, possessing a hidden individuality. Every direction of space corresponded to specific influences. This knowledge formed the basis of sacred geography, where cities or temples were often located through ritual determination, not simple convenience. The structure of space, celestial and terrestrial regions, high and low, vertical and horizontal, right and left, provided the material for a universal symbolism used to express metaphysical concepts, such as the cross. The orientation of temples and cathedrals until the Gothic Middle Ages obeyed laws of rhythm and analogy, aligning the visible with the invisible. The relationship between the traditional man and the land was intimate and vital, possessing a psychic character. The earth had both a geographical and a psychic individuality. Individuals were seen as depending on the region of their birth. For beings who lived according to the law of the collective and the soil, the lower, unformed strata, this relationship was often confined to tellurism, or a dependence on the subpersonal current of the blood/land. In superior traditions, the ownership of land was an aristocratic sacral privilege. In Rome, only the patricians, who held the lance and the sacrificial fire, right, possessed the right to own land. The land was considered inviolable and sacred, its boundaries protected by Uranic gods like Jupiter. This spiritualized ownership was seen as reflecting the victory of the cosmos order over chaos. Taking possession of new or wild land was viewed not as a profane human act, but as an act of creation. It was a ritual and magical action that aimed to give the land a form and make it participate in the sacred, transforming chaos into cosmos. The inheritance of the land was inseparable from the inheritance of the right. When this aristocratic right was lost and the land passed to the merchants or laborers, the land became profaned and was valued only as an economic factor for exploitation. The structure of the world is based on the opposition between the stable, transcendent principle of being and the mutable, immanent principle of becoming. This opposition is mirrored in the relationship between man and woman, masculine principle, spirit, being, yang. The masculine principle is conceived as the one, which is complete and sufficient in itself. Feminine principle, nature, becoming, yin. The feminine principle is the dyad, the principle of the diverse and the other than self, whose nature is to refer to something else. The man who aims for a traditional, superior form of existence must embody and affirm the transcendent masculine pole. This process involves the absolute affirmation of self and the overcoming of the feminine principle. The woman's path to realization differs fundamentally from the man's. Just as the caste doctrine demands adherence to one's own law or nature, the female physical difference corresponds to a spiritual difference. The woman realizes her distinct nature by turning her inherently relational principle towards a masculine stability. Her fulfillment is achieved through absolute dedication and fidelity, which must be lived with purity and as an offering. This dedication is often likened to bhakti, the virile form of devotion. The two fundamental types through which a woman realizes herself are as lover, the Aphroditic woman, and as mother. The mother who dies in childbirth was sometimes granted the same privilege of celestial immortality as the warrior who fell in battle, seeing the act as a comparable sacrifice. The woman could only enter the hierarchical sacred order mediately through relation to another, the man. Her adherence to traditional norms, rites, cult, was achieved through her father before marriage and through her spouse afterward. By devoting herself absolutely and disinterestedly to her man, she elevates her existence, making the man a means and a door. Ancient legal systems, such as in Doric Greece and Rome, placed the woman under the control of the father or husband, e.g., in manum viri, not out of injustice, but to define the limits and the natural place of the only spiritual way, conforming to the pure feminine nature. The modern push for equality and liberation is seen as a sign of irreversible decline, marking a profound subversion of natural and spiritual order. The emancipation of woman was destined to follow the emancipation of the servant and the glorification of the pariah. It is an inevitable symptom of the demise of a hierarchical world. The new civilization moves toward leveling and the amorphous, dissolving the decisive features of the sexes. Feminism is interpreted as a fundamental distrust of the new woman toward herself and an inability to conceive of feminine personality except in imitation of the male. This loss of unique qualities leads to the shapeless leveling that belongs to a stage not beyond, but before the individuation and differentiation of the sexes. When the necessary polarization is lost, when man is spiritually neutered and woman attempts to emulate man, relations become equivocal and chaotic. This leads to a type of being who is neither man nor woman, or woman the man and man the woman in their soul. This phenomenon, where sexual feeling begins and ends on the simple physiological plane or displays abnormal inclinations, is characterized as moving toward the third sex. The spiritual castration of modern man is the primary cause of female decadence. If man were truly virile, maintaining spiritual superiority and discipline, the woman would not have wished or been able to pursue the path of emancipation. Decline of superior races is the cancerous proliferation of the mass man, formless matter, resulting from the loss of spiritual virility, man's fault, and individualism, causing reverse selection and extinction. The decline is not merely a social or political event, but the agony of the superior Western races, which are considered the carriers of forces that transcend the masses. These races are superior not primarily in a biological sense, but because they possess the race of the spirit. The superior race acts as the principle of a generation in a superior sense by acting upon the physical matter of race and blood to imprint form and quality. The ultimate decline and trampling of civilizations is attributed to a fact of the same order, but in the opposite, degenerating sense as their founding divine fact. The physical manifestation of this spiritual decline is uncontrolled, quantitative growth of the inferior elements of society. The increasing unrestrained multiplication of the population in purely quantitative terms is likened to the vermicular proliferation occurring in the decomposition of organisms, or to cancer. Cancer is defined as the unrestrained hypertrophy of a plasma that devours the normal, differentiated structures of an organism, having escaped its regulating law. This proliferation is the boundless spread of matter and the formless, which constitutes the mass man. The regression and decline of the superior, formative forces correspond directly to the limitless proliferation of this formless matter. This aligns with the final phase of the regression of the castes, where power passes to the level of the slave servant, the fourth estate, leading to the dominance of the demonism of the pure demos. The fundamental causes of this catastrophe are spiritual failures in the superior elite, particularly the men. In the context of procreation, individualism, especially in the modern superior classes, diverts interest away from reproduction. Having broken the contacts with the superior realm, the individual feels unbound, and their subsequent actions are disorderly and dominated by solely temporal motives. The consequence of the spiritual abdication of the elite is that the biological and social system begins to operate contrary to the traditional hierarchical order. As the superior elements, the elite, the traditional man, lose their generating root from above and turn away from procreation due to individualistic and utilitarian considerations, the population growth concentrates instead in the lower social strata and inferior races, where the animalistic impulse is stronger than rational calculation. This demographic shift towards the inferior elements is termed reverse selection. The doctrine of the Four Ages defines history as an involutive regressive process where humanity falls from superior original states. This organic doctrine, found universally, e.g., Hesiod's gold, silver, bronze, iron, Hindu Satya Yuga to Kali Yuga, establishes the gradual decay, obscurement, Ragnarok, of traditional law, dharma, over 4 cycles. This doctrine is presented as the metaphysical basis for understanding the genesis of what is universally called the modern world. The process of decline along the 4 ages leads directly to the Iron Age, or Kali Yuga. The decline is seen through the objective law of the regression of the castes, which is analogically correlated with the 4 ages. The history of humanity moves from the age of the sacral heads, first caste, Gold Age, to the warrior nobility, second caste, Silver Age, to the merchants, third caste, and finally to the servants, massman, fourth caste, Iron Age, marking the ultimate phase of dissolution and the demonism of the pure demos. The Age of Gold, Satya Yuga, is the original civilization of being, transcendent truth. Defined by solarity/gold/glory, it was the era of the gods, possessing eternal life/incorruptibility. The pole and the Hyperborean seat is the original center of the world, combining a spiritual polar symbol, stability center, with a real northern region, Arctic area, Thule/Astlan/Arianem Vaejo. That was the seat of the Age of Gold. This region was inhabited by a race possessing pure Uranic tradition, light, glory, eternal life, which, due to a cosmic catastrophe, spiritual deviation, e.g. freezing/decline of Earth's axis, forced the race to emigrate. Atlantean cycle. This seat remains a symbolic reference for transcendent heroes/initiates, reachable only by the flight of the spirit. The Nordic Atlantic cycle represents the Second Age, Age of Silver, Dimitric, after the Age of Gold. It began after the emigration, north to south, then west to east, forced by the Arctic freezing cosmic catastrophe at the original Hyperborean polar seat. This cycle established an Atlantic center, Plato's Atlantis, that preserved the Uranic tradition in its elites but suffered alteration through meridional southern influences. The culture was defined by a mixed nature: 1. Race, Nordic Atlantic, Cro-Magnon, mixing with aboriginal southern Lemurian types, resulting in the Red Race. 2. Spirituality, Dimitric/lunar, characterized by the dominance of the Great Mother/feminine principle over the solar principle. The cycle closed with a diluvial catastrophe, Noah's, Plato's flood, sinking the Atlantean land, but its legacy endured in myths of the Western Isles, Avalon, Islands of the Dead, and was transmitted by subsequent conquering races, e.g. Achaeans, Dorics, Nahua, Incas. The mother civilization, Age of Silver, Dimitric, views the feminine principle, Dea, as supreme, making man mortal, conditioned. This gynocracy features ritual virility destitution, e.g. castration, and promotes shapeless equality, communism. All are children of Mother Earth. The heroic cycle, partial restoration, follows the mother civilization, Age of Silver. It overcomes Titanism, Age of Bronze, violence, and Amazonism. The hero, Uranic/solar, fights these forces to restore spiritual virility and achieve immortality. The heroic cycle represents a phase of resurgence or a partial and special restoration of the primordial state. It stands in contrast to the continuous decline characterizing the 4 main ages. According to Hesiod's schema, the Age of Heroes is situated between the Age of Bronze and the Age of Iron. However, conceptually, it follows the mother civilization, which is typologically defined by the Age of Silver. The Age of Silver was characterized by the feminine/lunar principle and a priesthood that subordinated the male solar principle. The heroic cycle manifests the attempt to restore the tradition of the origins on the basis of the warrior principle and military qualification. The heroic cycle confronts and overcomes 2 types of spiritual and moral deviation that mark the Age of Bronze. Titanism. Titanism represents the degeneration of the Nordic light tradition, characterized by a materialized, violent, and quasi-individualistic race that rejects spiritual authority. Titans, like the biblical giants, Nephilim, are associated with violence, pride, and the usurpation of celestial knowledge for purely human, material ends, for example, Prometheus stealing fire. The Age of Bronze is marked by brutal strength, wild pleasure in violence, war, and material supremacy. The hero is the one who resolves the Titan element and liberates Prometheus, having sided with the Olympian principle, Zeus, in the struggle against the giants. The heroic cycle transforms the Titan attempt, which failed due to being polluted by human ambition, into a successful transcendent adventure. The heroic effort also targets the abnormal deviation of the feminine principle that arose in response to Titanism. Amazonism. This is characterized as a spiritual gynocracy abnormally potentiated. It is a desperate reaction of the lunar, sacerdotal spiritual principle, the feminine aspect of the spirit, which, having lost its rightful authority due to the Titan revolt, attempts to restore its primacy using the same material and violent means of its masculine opponents. The heroic cycle is marked by the theme of opposition against every Amazonian attempt. Mythical figures like the Doric Heracles, Theseus, and Bellerophon fight and exterminate the Amazons. By defeating the Amazons, the hero restores the proper hierarchical dynamic, ensuring that the spiritual authority is no longer tainted by the material violence inherent in Amazonian usurpation. The entire cycle is defined by the quality of the hero who embodies the restored superior principle. The hero is the archetypal figure of pure virility. The heroic cycle represents a resurrection of the Nordic light. The hero is characterized by action and contemplation. They embody the spirit that is detached from the feminine and the telluric. The heroic ideal aims at achieving the unconditioned state. The heroic victory, symbolized by the conquest of sacred life-giving women who embody transcendental wisdom or power, and the vanquishing of monsters, like dragons or serpents, is interpreted as the integration of the hero's virile character on a superior plane. This spiritualized virility triumphs over the Titan's crude violence and the Amazon's material defense. The ultimate goal is to surpass the mortal condition and achieve Olympic immortality. Immortality is conferred only upon a portion of the heroes who succeed in their adventure. Heroic action, when oriented transcendentally, resolves the dualism of material existence by functioning as a sacrificial rite, which can elevate the individual from terrestrial existence to the immortal, uranic nature of the gods. This conquest is symbolized by receiving the laurel crown of the victorious, achieving the unbreakable life, or being snatched away to the solar realms of the dead, like Valhalla or the House of the Sun. The superior, active, male principle spirituality, tradition, and the inferior, passive, female principle spirituality, anti-tradition, traces the historical decline of the solar, Aryan, heroic spirit, active liberation against telluric, sacerdotal, feminine influences. America saw heroic solar elements degenerate into blood frenzy. Egypt/Babylon shifted from regal/solar authority to lunar/sacerdotal dominance. Hebrew tradition used law as a substitute for unity. India declined from solar to contemplative/sacerdotal spirituality due to race mixing. Islam maintained a complete tradition based on action/holy war, jihad. The Western heroic Uranic cycle, Greece/Rome, attempted to restore the solar spirit. Greece established Olympian/heroic form, but decayed into rationalism/democracy. Rome achieved the last great restoration, creating universal imperium through heroic ascesis and sacral law before dissolution. The Western tradition's syncope followed the decline of virile, sacral Rome, succumbing to Asiatic/Southern cults and imperial leveling. It was caused by original Christianity, which promoted equality and the collective ideal, contradicting the heroic, hierarchical Roman spirit. This fractured the unity of king and priest, deeming combined power demonic, and secularized political authority by refusing sacred loyalty to the empire. The as symbol in Christ's myth suggests a traditional dissolutive force. The conflict between the imperial and papal authorities during the Middle Ages, viewed through the lens of traditionalist metaphysics, primarily focusing on the attempt by the empire, Ghibellinism, to restore a sacred, virile order against the dominance of a feminine religious universalism, Guelphism. The Ghibelline Middle Ages represented the final great traditional manifestation that the West knew. The decline of the original Roman idea of the empire, imperium, was followed by its revival, renovatio Romani imperii, by new forces. This restoration was essentially driven by the Germanic element. These Nordic Germanic peoples were considered affine to the original Achaean, Paleo-Iranian, and Paleo-Roman stocks, and were seen as carrying a vivifying influence. While later Germanic tribes may have lost the conscious memory of the primordial tradition, their deepest inheritance included remnants of this tradition and an innate worldview supportive of heroic cycles. The life of these peoples was fundamentally shaped by the principles of honor, fidelity, and fierceness. The Ghibelline imperial ideal immediately entered into a profound conflict with the opposing universal power, the Church. This antagonism represented a deeper struggle between two incompatible visions, mirroring the antithesis of the North and the South, the solar spirituality and the lunar spirituality. The Church's claim to superiority was based on a dualistic conception where the spiritual government was likened to the soul and the regal government to the body. Thus, the Church, ruling the soul, implicitly prepared for the subordination of the secular power, the body. The Church frequently embraced a symbolism of maternal authority, considering itself the mother and the emperor its son. This reflected a gynecocratic vision in which the maternal principle possessed spiritual authority and the right to rule over the male who was tied to corruptible temporal reality. This type of spirituality is defined as lunar. Ghibellinism sought to overcome this division, embodying a secret tendency to reconstruct the original unity of the two powers, the regal and the hieratic, sacred and virile. The empire was conceived as a super-political and universal reality with a supernatural origin. The emperor was seen as a deus homo, totus deificatus et sanctificatus, and the living embodiment of law, lex animata in terris. The imperial principle was associated with solar spirituality, representing a transcendent and differentiating principle, in contrast to the Church's feminine spirituality. Ghibelline emperors, particularly the Hohenstaufens, affirmed their authority came directly from God, recognizing only God above them, thus asserting a sacred authority independent of the mediating priesthood. This was the last echo of the concept of sacred royalty on a universal plane in the West. The ascetic warrior spirit of chivalry provided the essential aristocracy and vital force supporting the imperial structure. Chivalry served as the natural complement to the imperial idea, standing in the same relationship to the empire as the clergy stood to the Church. The core ideal of chivalry involved reconstituting the unity of the warrior and the ascetic elements. Knights often sought the ideal of the hero rather than the saint, prioritizing honor and fidelity over Christian humility or caritas. The medieval ecumene declined because the empire secularized, losing its spiritual base and fides, leading to national states and centralized monarchies. This paved the way for demagoguery and the Third Estate, bourgeoisie, resulting in the fragmentation of the universal order. The Church failed to assume the Empire's legacy. The further fall of the West began with the interruption of contact between the human temporal world and the superworld. This led to humanism, where everything begins and ends in man. This decline is characterized by individualism, constituting a false center separate from the true center, leading to construction rather than being. This false mortal I creates illusions lacking spiritual reality. Irrealism, a radical lack of reality or intrinsic organization in modern life. Loss of initiation, the lack of objective, real initiation, which assures contact with the superworld, meant spiritual reality devolved into faith, sentiment, or theological speculation, mythology/irrealism, rationalism/scientism. The rise of rationalism and scientism, replacing spirit with abstract discursive thought, furthered irrealism and naturalism. This led to the creation of constructs based on purely human faculties, culminating in technology/machinery. Democratization/fragmentation. Individualistic usurpation was followed by collective limitation. The abolition of traditional hierarchies, caste, privilege, led to libertarian disintegration and subsequent absorption into the brute collective power, signaling a progression toward chaos and the subpersonal. Western decline follows the law of the regression of castes. Power and civilization progressively descend through the four castes. 1. Sacral chiefs, priests, pontifices, ended with the waning of divine kingship and the last echo of the highest tradition in the Ghibelline imperial ideal. 2. Warrior nobility, authority passed to military monarchs who were political heads, prioritizing bloodline, not spiritual, kingship. This stage is marked by feudal monarchies where Fides loyalty honor replaced religious authority. 3. Bourgeoisie/merchants. Monarchies were supplanted by capitalistic oligarchies, the merchant caste. The social bond became the contract based on material interest, leading to the victory of the economy, plutocracy, and the rise of liberal democratic ideologies. 4. Servants, laborers. The final stage is the rise of the proletariat, massman. Power shifts to the lowest caste, reducing all values to the material plane, the economy and labor. This culminates in the ideal of a universal communist civilization. This regression leads to the collapse of hierarchical order and is visible across all domains: politics, art, ethics. The traditional universal ideal regresses to collectivism. Modern nationalism is an artificial centralizing phase, promoting the demos and serving as a bridge to the anonymous fourth estate, communism, focused purely on organized production and technology. The cycle closes with the convergence of Bolshevism and Americanism, representing two facets of the same terminal process. 1. Russia, Bolshevism. Characterized by cold, calculated revolution, Lenin, Trotsky, aimed at radically surpassing individualism, humanism. It institutes a collectivism directed downward, subpersonal, resulting in a total social servitude and a mechanical structure that idealizes organized production. It views the Romano-Germanic world as the primary obstacle. 2. America, US, represents the spontaneous realization of the same terminus. It prioritizes material conquest and prosperity. Its focus on technique and rendimento, efficiency, productivity, creates a de facto collectivism, society of rendimento, that reduces millions to automatons. The American spirit is marked by standardization, conformity, and a focus on material needs, culminating in a base, subpersonal existence, primitive, dangerous. Both systems converge toward the advent of the beast without name. Any final conflict between them will be the last violent operation completing the regression of castes to the lowest, servant/massman, leading to a collective humanity and the total collapse of civilization. The cycle of decline is total and irreversible. Salvation requires a vast, unitary return to the traditional spirit, which lacks a current basis. Catholicism fails. The Dark Age must complete itself. Hope exists only for a minority through invisible continuity of tradition, offering unattenuated measures to seekers, or riding the tiger, using modern destruction for personal liberation.